Welcome to Sleepy Crimes. I am Anna, your host. Tonight, we drift into the shadows of the disappearance of Bryce Laspisa. Imagine, if you will, the end of August in the year 2013. The air in Northern California is thick and heavy, holding onto the residual heat of a long, golden summer. It is a time of transitions, of students returning to lecture halls, and the slow shifting of the light as the days begin to shorten. In the town of Roseville, just outside of Sacramento, a 19-year-old young man named Bryce is preparing for his sophomore year at Sierra College. He is a boy of striking features, bright red hair and piercing green eyes, with a gentle, charismatic energy that seems to draw people toward him. He is an artist, a student of graphic and industrial design, with a portfolio full of intricate, geometric patterns that hint at a mind, both creative and deeply structured. But as the final days of August unfold, a quiet fracture begins to form in the steady rhythm of his life. The environment around Bryce is one of suburban normalcy, yet there is a subtle tension in the atmosphere. His apartment, which he shares with a roommate named Sean, is filled with the typical trappings of college life: textbooks, half-empty coffee cups, and the low hum of an Xbox. But Bryce has begun to move through these spaces like a ghost. He has started to give away his most prized possessions. He hands over his gaming console to Sean, along with a pair of diamond earrings given to him by his mother. It is as if he is shedding the weight of his old self, unburdening his soul for a journey he has yet to name. His behavior is becoming erratic, marked by long nights of gaming fueled by stimulants and a sudden, sharp distance from those who love him. On the 27th of August, he breaks up with his girlfriend, Kim, via a text message, telling her that she would be better off without him. The shadows are lengthening, and the stage is being set for a drive that should have taken 7 hours, but would instead stretch into an eternity. On the night of August 28th, Bryce decides to leave. He climbs into his beige 2003 Toyota Highlander, a sturdy vehicle meant for long stretches of highway. His destination is his parents' home in Laguna Niguel, nearly 500 miles to the south. The road before him is the Interstate 5, a vast, asphalt artery that cuts through the heart of California's Central Valley. As he pulls away from the curb in Roseville, the streetlights cast long, flickering shadows across his hood. The hum of the engine is a steady, low vibration beneath his hands. Outside, the world is silent, save for the occasional rush of wind against the glass. He is a young man alone in the dark, heading toward the mountains and the sea, while his parents, Karen and Michael, wait in the quiet comfort of Orange County, expecting their son to arrive by dawn. They have no way of knowing that the simple act of driving home is about to become a descent into a mystery that will remain unsolved for over a decade. As the miles fall away, the landscape transforms. The lush greenery of the north gives way to the arid, golden hills of the valley. The smell of the air changes, turning dusty and dry, carrying the scent of parched earth and exhaust. Bryce is driving through the deep well of the night, where the only landmarks are the glowing signs of truck stops and the distant, shimmering lights of farmhouses. The interior of the car is a small, private world, lit by the pale green glow of the dashboard. We can almost feel the texture of the fabric seats, the coolness of the air conditioning, and the rhythmic thrum of the tires hitting the expansion joints on the freeway. But Bryce is not driving with the urgency of someone returning home. He is drifting. He stops. He lingers. At one point, he runs out of gasoline near a small town called Buttonwillow. A local mechanic named Christian is dispatched to help him, delivering 3 gallons of fuel to the roadside. Christian finds a young man who seems lucid, perhaps a bit tired, but otherwise fine. And yet, after receiving the gas, Bryce does not move. He sits in his car for hours, staring out at the horizon as the sun begins to climb into the sky. The day of August 29th passes in a strange, suspended state. Bryce's parents are now aware that something is wrong. They track his location through credit card charges and phone pings. They speak to him, urging him to keep moving, to come home so they can talk and figure out what is troubling him. Bryce assures them he is on his way, but the hours continue to slip through his fingers. He moves only a few miles in half a day. He is caught in a loop of hesitation, anchored to a spot on the map for reasons only he understands. The heat of the valley is oppressive now, shimmering off the pavement in waves. Imagine the stillness of that car, parked on the shoulder of the busiest road in the state, while thousands of people rush past, unaware of the quiet crisis unfolding inside that beige SUV. Bryce is a 19-year-old at a crossroads, perched on the edge of the Sierra Pelona Mountains, as the second night of his journey begins to fall. The long road south is no longer just a path home. It has become a labyrinth of the mind, and the exit is nowhere in sight. The sun climbs high over the Central Valley, casting a relentless white heat across the asphalt of Buttonwillow. It is a place defined by transit, a cluster of gas stations and fast food stops designed for those who are going somewhere else. But on this Thursday, the 29th of August, 2013, 19-year-old Bryce Laspisa has stopped. His tan Toyota Highlander sits motionless on the side of the road, a quiet island in a sea of shimmering heat waves. Earlier that morning, around 9 o'clock, he had run out of fuel. A man named Christian, the owner of a local tire and truck shop, had arrived with 3 gallons of gasoline. He saw a young man who seemed tired but otherwise ordinary. Bryce thanked him, paid the $20 fee, and watched the mechanic drive away. One would expect Bryce to turn the key, merge back onto the highway, and finish the final 3 hours of his journey home to Orange County. But he does not. He stays. Back in Laguna Niguel, Karen and Michael Laspisa wait for a door to open that never does. They had seen the roadside assistance charge on their account and felt a surge of relief, thinking their son was finally on the move. But as the hours of the late morning bleed into the afternoon, the silence from Bryce's phone becomes a physical weight. By 11 o'clock, the anxiety has grown too heavy to ignore. Karen reaches out to Christian, the man who had brought the gas, asking if he might go back and check on the boy. Christian, showing a kindness that would later define him in the records of this case, agrees to return to that lonely stretch of road. When he arrives around noon, his heart sinks. The Highlander is in the exact same spot. Bryce is still behind the wheel, staring forward into the dusty haze of the valley. He hasn't moved an inch. He isn't eating, he isn't drinking, and he isn't calling home. He is simply existing in a state of absolute, inexplicable stasis. The air in the Central Valley has a specific weight, a mixture of dry earth and the exhaust of 1,000 engines. Inside the car, the silence must have been absolute. The dashboard, hot to the touch, radiates the heat of the afternoon sun as temperatures climb toward 90 degrees. Every few minutes, a heavy gust of wind from a passing truck rocks the Highlander, a gentle push against a vessel that refuses to sail. Bryce's white cargo shorts and blue checkered shirt would have felt heavy and damp against the seat. It is a long, slow accumulation of minutes. This isn't just a rest, it is a suspension of time. He isn't reaching for his duffel bag or looking at his laptop. He is just there, caught in a quiet gravity that the rest of the world cannot see. When Christian approaches him again and hands over his own cell phone so Bryce can speak to his mother, the conversation is unsettlingly brief. Bryce tells her he is fine. He says he is just blowing off steam. He promises he will start driving soon. But when the phone is handed back and the car door clicks shut, the stillness returns. By 6 in the evening, the parents can no longer wait. They contact the local authorities, and eventually, the Kern County Sheriff's Department is alerted. 2 deputies are dispatched to find the vehicle that has become a permanent fixture on the Buttonwillow roadside. When they pull up behind the Highlander, they find Bryce exactly where he has been for nearly 10 hours. They ask him to step out into the cooling evening air. They look into his blue eyes, searching for the telltale signs of intoxication, the glassy stare of a high, or the frantic energy of a mental break. They find none of it. They administer a field sobriety test, the standard walk and turn, the finger to the nose. Bryce passes every single one with calm precision. He is lucid, polite, and cooperative. He allows them to search his car, which yields nothing unusual. No drugs, no alcohol, no weapons. To the officers, he is simply a young man who is taking a very long break. They cannot force him to move, but they urge him to call his mother. They watch as he dials the number, promising once again that he is on his way home. The sun begins to dip below the horizon, painting the California sky in bruised purples and deep oranges. The deputies leave, satisfied that Bryce is not a danger to himself or others. Yet, even as the blue and red lights fade into the distance, Bryce does not immediately pull away. He remains in the growing dark for another few hours, his phone remaining silent as the clock ticks toward 8 and 9 in the evening. Christian, the mechanic who has spent his entire day tethered to this stranger's drama, decides to check one last time. He finds Bryce still there, under the yellow glow of the streetlights. This time, Christian does not just watch him. He insists on following him. For 10 miles, the mechanic's truck stays behind the Highlander, ensuring that Bryce actually merges onto the southbound lanes of Interstate 5. He watches the taillights fade into the night, heading toward the steep climb of the mountains. He calls Karen to give her the news. Her son is finally moving. The stasis of Buttonwillow has broken, but as the lights of the small town vanish in his rearview mirror, the mystery is only just beginning to deepen. The deputies have pulled away, their taillights fading into the vast, ink-black expanse of the California night. Bryce is alone again, sitting in the stillness of his 2003 Toyota Highlander. The air outside is heavy with the scent of dry earth and the distant hum of the interstate, but inside the cabin, there is only the faint, rhythmic ticking of a cooling engine. On the passenger seat, his phone glows, a small, artificial sun in the darkness. For his mother, Karen, 300 miles away in Laguna Niguel, that glowing screen has become the center of her universe. Every vibration, every chime, carries the weight of 1,000 unspoken fears. She is caught in a cycle of static and silence, reaching out across the miles to a son who sounds like himself, yet feels worlds away. To understand the weight of this night, we must look back at the trail of voices left behind over the last 24 hours. It began with a call on Wednesday afternoon, around 1 o'clock. Bryce had sounded calm, almost clinical, as he told his mother he was breaking up with his girlfriend, Kim. It was a surprising turn for a young man who seemed so deeply in love, but Karen didn't hear panic in his voice, only a strange, flat resolve. Later that night, the calls became more frequent, more jagged. He told her he had so much to talk to her about, a phrase that hung in the air like a heavy curtain. When Karen offered to hop on a plane and fly north to see him, he refused. "Do not come yet," he told her. "Wait until we talk tomorrow." Those words, spoken in the quiet hours of the morning, would later echo in her mind as a haunting prelude to the stillness that followed. By Thursday morning, the nature of the calls shifted from emotional to logistical, and then to something far more baffling. At 11 in the morning, Karen received an automated notification from their insurance company. Roadside assistance had been summoned to a location in Buttonwillow, a small, dusty transit point in the Central Valley. Bryce had run out of gasoline at 9 that morning. Panic began to sharpen into a fine point. Why was he in Buttonwillow? Why was he out of fuel? When Karen finally reached him, he was brief. He was fine, he said. He was just tired. He promised he was on his way home, a journey that should have taken him less than 3 hours. But as the sun climbed to its zenith and began its slow descent, the odometer on his car remained frozen. He was not moving. He was simply sitting on the edge of the road, watching the world pass him by. The afternoon was a slow-motion nightmare of check-ins. Karen called the service station owner, a man named Christian, who had delivered the fuel. Christian was kind enough to go back and check on the boy, finding him still parked in the same spot hours later. When Bryce finally spoke to his mother again, his demeanor was eerily consistent. He didn't sound distressed or confused. He sounded hollow. He would tell her he was starting the car, that he was pulling onto the ramp, that he would see her soon. Yet every time she checked his location or called back, he was still there. It was as if he were trapped in a loop of intentions, unable to bridge the gap between the thought of moving and the action itself. The space between them was filled with the white noise of the valley and the growing realization that her son was drifting into a fog she couldn't reach. As the evening deepened into the night of August 29th, the calls took on a desperate rhythm. The police had checked on him twice now, and each time they reported the same thing: a polite, lucid young man who passed every test and gave every right answer. He told the officers he was headed home to see his parents. He told his parents he was practically there. But by 10 o'clock at night, he had only moved 8 miles in 9 hours. The discrepancy was staggering. Karen sat in her living room, the house quiet and expectant, holding the phone so tightly her knuckles turned white. She was trying to read between the lines of his short sentences, looking for a sign of a breakdown or a plea for help, but Bryce offered only the smooth surface of a mask. "I am okay, Mom. I am coming home." Then came the final call. It was 2 in the morning on Friday, August 30th. The world was at its darkest and most silent. Bryce's voice came through the receiver, thin and weary. He told Karen he was pulling off the road again, somewhere near the Sierra Pelona Mountains. He was too tired to drive the final stretch, he said. He was going to sleep for a few hours in the car and finish the trip when the sun came up. In that moment, a flicker of relief must have washed over his mother. If he was sleeping, he was safe. If he was resting, the strange lethargy of the last day would surely pass. She told him she loved him. She told him to call her the second he woke up. She agreed to the plan, believing that the morning would bring her son back to her front door. But the morning did not bring Bryce. It brought only more silence. As Karen watched the clock tick past 5, then 6, then 7 in the morning, the phone remained still on the kitchen counter. The 3-hour drive had become a 30-hour mystery. She didn't know that while she was waiting for the phone to ring, a different set of lights was flashing in a ravine near Castaic Lake. She didn't know that the voice she heard at 2 in the morning was the last piece of her son she would ever hold onto. The static on the line had finally won, and as the sun rose over the mountains, it illuminated a scene of violence and void where a young man's journey had come to a sudden, shattering end. But the morning did not bring Bryce. It brought only more silence. As Karen watched the clock tick past 5, then 6, then 7 in the morning, the golden light of August 29th, 2013, began to spill over the horizon of Laguna Niguel. The heat of a California summer was already starting to bake the pavement, but for the Laspisas, the air felt cold with the weight of the unknown. They expected their son to be pulling into the driveway at any moment, weary from the drive but safe. Instead, the only communication they received was a notification from their insurance company. A roadside assistance call had been placed from a small, dusty town called Buttonwillow. It was roughly 3 hours north of their home. Bryce had run out of gas. In the flat, sun-bleached expanse of the Central Valley, a man named Christian was answering that call. Christian worked for Castro Tire and Truck, a local service station that often handled the stranded motorists of Interstate 5. He drove his service truck out to a rest area where a beige Toyota Highlander sat idling on the shoulder. The landscape there is stark, dominated by the smell of diesel fumes, dry earth, and the constant, rhythmic roar of semi-trucks barreling toward Lowe's Angels. When Christian pulled up behind the vehicle around 9 in the morning, he expected to find a frustrated traveler eager to get back on the road. What he found instead was a young man who seemed to be existing in a different world entirely. Bryce was sitting behind the wheel, his hands resting loosely. Christian noticed immediately that the 19-year-old's eyes were bloodshot, a vivid red that stood out against his pale complexion. He looked exhausted, yet there was no sense of urgency in his movements. Christian began the routine task of delivering 3 gallons of fuel, the metallic clink of the gas echoing against the silence of the SUV's cabin. He expected Bryce to hop out, perhaps offer a hand or ask how far it was to the next major stop. But Bryce remained mostly still. He was polite when spoken to, answering in short, quiet sentences, but his gaze was fixed forward. He looked through the windshield, as if the road ahead was a puzzle he couldn't quite solve. Christian would later describe Bryce's demeanor as strangely calm, almost vacant. There was no panic about being stranded, no frustration over the delay. After the gas was poured and the $20 transaction was completed, Christian assumed the boy would pull back onto the highway and continue his journey south. But as the service truck drove away, the beige Highlander stayed parked. It sat there under the mounting heat of the morning sun, a solitary island of metal in the middle of the vast California scrubland. To Christian, it was just another job, a small footnote in a long day of roadside repairs. He had no way of knowing that he was one of the last people who would see Bryce Laspisa in a state of relative peace. Back in Laguna Niguel, the news of the gas delivery brought a fleeting sense of relief to Karen and Mike. At least they knew where he was. They knew he was alive. But as 10 in the morning turned into 11, and 11 turned into noon, the relief soured into a fresh kind of dread. Buttonwillow was only a few hours away. If Bryce had received fuel at 9, he should have walked through their front door long ago. The math simply didn't add up. Why was he still out there? Karen tried to call him again and again, the ringing tone filling the quiet rooms of their house, only to be met with the flat, digital recording of his voicemail. The silence from Bryce was becoming a physical presence, a heavy shadow that refused to lift. Growing desperate, the Laspisas tracked down the number for Castro Tire and Truck. They reached Christian again around 3 in the afternoon. When they explained that Bryce still hadn't arrived home, Christian was surprised. He told them he would head back out to the same spot to see if the boy was still there. It seemed impossible that a teenager with a full tank of gas would remain on the shoulder of a highway for 6 hours. Yet when Christian arrived at the rest area, his heart must have skipped a beat. There was the Highlander. It was in the exact same position as it had been that morning. Bryce hadn't moved. He was still sitting in the driver's seat, staring out at the shimmering heat waves rising from the asphalt. This second encounter was even more unsettling than the first. Christian approached the car and handed Bryce his own cell phone, telling him that his mother was on the line and she was terrified. Bryce took the phone with a slow, deliberate motion. When he spoke to Karen, he offered no explanation for the delay. He didn't mention being tired or being lost. He simply said he was hanging out. It was a phrase that made no sense given the circumstances. He was hanging out on the side of a blistering hot interstate, surrounded by nothing but dust and the sound of traffic. Christian stood by, watching the young man, noted the vacant expression hadn't changed. There was a profound stillness in Bryce, a terrifying lack of intent that seemed to paralyze him in place. Determined to help, Christian stayed with him. He didn't just walk away this time. He waited, watching as Bryce eventually pulled the car back into gear. To ensure the boy actually made it onto the interstate, Christian followed him in his service truck for about 10 miles. He watched the Toyota merge into the flow of traffic, heading south toward the Grapevine, toward home. Christian called Karen one last time to tell her that her son was finally on his way. He felt he had done his part, guiding a lost soul back to the path. He watched the taillights of Bryce's car fade into the distance, believing the crisis was over. But on that long, lonely stretch of Interstate 5, the shadows were only getting longer. The engine of the 2003 beige Toyota Highlander hums with a steady, low vibration as Bryce finally leaves the stagnant air of Buttonwillow behind. For 13 hours, That car had been a stationary island in a sea of asphalt. But now, the wheels are turning, eating up the miles of Interstate 5 South. It is the deep, hollow middle of the night on August 30th, 2013. Outside the glass, the flat, industrial landscape of the Central Valley begins to ripple and swell. The horizon is no longer a straight line, but a jagged silhouette of rising peaks. He is approaching the Grapevine, that formidable mountain pass where the road climbs steeply into the Tejon Pass, winding through the darkness of the Sierra Pelona Mountains. The air cooling outside the vents is sharp, carrying the scent of dry brush and high-altitude dust. Inside the cabin, the glow from the instrument panel casts a soft, amber light over Bryce's face. Every few seconds, the rhythmic flash of white and yellow reflectors on the pavement sweeps across the interior, a hypnotic pulse in the gloom. He is alone, suspended in the silence of the drive. The heavy trucks, those glowing giants of the midnight highway, roar past him with a rush of wind that rocks the Highlander slightly, their red taillights fading into the distance like dying embers. Despite the hours of sitting still, Bryce is moving with a strange, quiet purpose now. His phone, resting in the center console, remains dark for a time, a silent witness to whatever thoughts are circling in his mind as the incline grows steeper and the engine shifts gear to compensate for the climb. At approximately 2 a.m, the silence is broken by the familiar chime of a cell phone. Bryce reaches out and dials home. On the other end, in Laguna Niguel, his mother, Karen, answers. Her voice is a mix of exhaustion and profound relief. She has been waiting for this call, counting the minutes of a journey that should have ended hours ago. Bryce tells her he is tired. He says his eyes are heavy and the road is becoming a blur. He tells her he is going to pull off the highway in a suburban area, find a quiet spot, and sleep for a few hours before finishing the final leg of the trip. To a worried parent, this sounds like the most responsible choice he could make. Karen agrees, telling him she loves him and will see him in the morning. At 2:08, the line goes dead. It is the last time she will ever hear his voice. But as the call ends, Bryce does not pull over. He does not find a quiet suburban street to rest his head. Instead, the Highlander continues south, cresting the summit and beginning the long, winding descent toward the Santa Clarita Valley. The road here is treacherous, a series of sweeping curves that drop thousands of feet in elevation. The brakes of the SUV grow warm, the faint smell of hot metal and friction rising into the night air. To his right, the darkness is absolute, a vast canyon that swallows the light of his high beams. He is less than an hour from home now, yet he bypasses the exits that would lead him to his parents' driveway. He is drifting deeper into the shadows of the Grapevine, moving toward a destination that only he seems to understand. Just after 2:15 in the morning, a security camera at a recreation area near Castaic Lake flickers to life. It captures a glimpse of a beige SUV turning off the main road and heading up toward the lake. This is Lake Hughes Road, a winding, 2-lane strip of asphalt that hugs the rugged hills above the water. There are no streetlights here. The only illumination comes from the moon and the piercing white light of the Highlander's lamps reflecting off the dry grass. For over 2 hours, the car vanishes from the grid. We can only imagine the sound of the tires on the gravel, the wind whistling through the roof racks, and the stillness of the water below, hidden in the blackness of the ravine. Then, at 4:29 in the morning, the camera catches the SUV again. It is still there, circling. Why is he still awake? Why is he still driving these same few miles of mountain road when sleep was supposedly his only priority? The mystery of these 2 hours is a heavy, suffocating blanket. The vehicle turns, its tires crunching on the shoulder, moving toward a specific overlook near the main ramp road. From the driver's seat, looking out over the embankment, the surface of Castaic Lake might have looked closer than it truly was. A silver mirror reflecting the stars, appearing just a short distance beyond the edge of the road. Bryce shifts the car into gear one last time. The engine revs, the sound echoing off the canyon walls, breaking the peace of the early morning as the vehicle accelerates toward the steep drop-off. The darkness of the early morning hours began to thin, giving way to a pale, bruised light over the hills of Castaic Lake. It was 5:30 in the morning on Friday, the 30th of August, 2013. The world was beginning to stir, but in the quiet canyons north of Los Angeles, the silence was still absolute. A park worker, a man used to the predictable rhythms of the dawn, drove toward the main ramp road to begin his morning rounds. His task was simple: unlock the gates, breathe in the cool air, and prepare the boat launch for the day's visitors. He did not expect to see a scar in the landscape. As he neared a 25-foot embankment, his headlights caught a glint of metal resting where only brush and dirt should be. He pulled his vehicle to a stop, the gravel crunching loudly in the stillness, and looked down. There, at the bottom of the ravine, lay a beige 2003 Toyota Highlander. It was resting unnaturally on its passenger side, tilted against the earth like a discarded toy. The vehicle was silent, its engine long dead, and as the worker stared down into the shadows, a cold realization settled in his chest. This was not a parked car. This was a wreck. The worker scrambled toward the edge, his breath hitching in the thin morning air. From his vantage point, the drop looked steep, a dizzying 25 feet of jagged slope. The SUV had not simply rolled, it had plummeted. Yet, as he looked closer, the car did not seem completely crushed. It was intact enough that someone could have survived, but as his eyes searched the windows for any sign of movement, he saw nothing. No one called out. No one waved for help. The scene was eerily stagnant. When the California Highway Patrol arrived shortly after, the investigation shifted from a routine traffic accident to something much more haunting. There were no skid marks on the road above, no signs of a driver slamming on the brakes in a panic or trying to swerve back onto the pavement. Instead, the tracks suggested something purposeful. The vehicle had accelerated. It had been steered over the edge of the embankment with enough speed to clear the initial brush, launching into the void. It was as if the driver had intended to reach the water of the lake, which sat just beyond the road below, shimmering like a dark mirror in the fading night. As the officers descended the slope, the smell of dry earth and gasoline hung in the air. They approached the overturned Highlander with caution, their flashlights cutting through the dimness of the ravine. When they reached the vehicle, they found the rear window had been completely shattered. It wasn't the jagged, inward-folding break of a collision. The glass lay in a glittering spray on the dirt outside the car, indicating it had been smashed from the inside out. Near the back of the SUV, they discovered a small, heavy object, an emergency glass-breaking tool. It sat there like an overturned lantern that had lost its flame, a grim testament to a struggle for escape. This was how the driver had gotten out. They hadn't crawled through a door or climbed through the front. They had retreated to the very back of the vehicle, used the tool to break their way into the world, and disappeared into the brush. The officers peered through the broken frame, expecting to find a body or a trail of significant blood, but the interior was largely empty of life. It was as if the car had been purged of its passenger. Inside the cabin, the details grew even more unsettling. On the passenger seat headrest, the light of a flashlight revealed a small, dark stain, a few droplets of blood. There were a few more spots on the back seat, but not enough to suggest a life-threatening injury. It was the kind of blood you might leave behind after a sharp bump to the nose or a cut from a piece of flying glass. But while the driver was gone, his life remained behind in a series of abandoned objects. Bryce's cell phone was there. His laptop was there. His wallet, containing his identification and credit cards, sat within the vehicle's confines. These were the tethers to his identity, the tools he would need to navigate the world, yet he had left them all in the wreckage. Outside, resting on the dirt near the shattered rear window, was a duffel bag. It had been zipped open, its contents rummaged through as if someone had been searching for one specific thing in a frantic hurry before moving on. The bag sat in the dust, a lonely sentinel marking the spot where Bryce Laspisa had last been accounted for. The investigators stood in the shadow of the embankment, looking from the discarded wallet to the dark surface of the lake. The geometry of the crash was baffling. If Bryce had wanted to end his life, why would he use a glass breaker to escape the car after the impact? If he was disoriented and injured, why was there so little blood and no sign of him wandering nearby? The car was like a shell, a hollow monument to a moment of extreme violence that had resulted in a vanishing act. Back in Laguna Niguel, Michael and Karen were still waiting, their eyes fixed on the driveway, expecting to see the headlights of that very Highlander turning the corner at any moment. They didn't know that miles away, their son's car was being processed as a crime scene. They didn't know that the phone they kept calling was vibrating against a seat in a ravine, its screen lighting up with "Mom" over and over again into the empty air. The lantern had been overturned, the light was out, and the boy who had been driving was nowhere to be found. The morning air at Castaic Lake on August 30, 2013, was heavy with the scent of dry brush and cooling asphalt. As the first light of dawn began to creep over the ridges of the Sierra Pelona Mountains, it illuminated a scene that defied simple explanation. At the bottom of a 25-foot embankment, resting on its passenger side, lay a 2003 beige Toyota Highlander. The dust, kicked up by its violent descent, had settled, leaving the vehicle looking like a prehistoric beast that had simply collapsed in the middle of the access road to the main boat ramp. There were no skid marks on the road above, only the evidence of a vehicle that had maintained its speed, or perhaps even accelerated, as it crossed the threshold into the void. The silence in the ravine was absolute, broken only by the occasional metallic ping of the engine cooling in the shadows. When investigators first approached the wreckage, the beam of a flashlight cut through the dim interior, dancing over the shattered safety glass that lay scattered across the road like diamonds. They noticed something peculiar about the rear window. It had been smashed outward from the inside. It appeared that Bryce had used a tool, perhaps a heavy object from his belongings, to clear a path through the reinforced glass. This wasn't the frantic exit of someone trapped in a sinking vessel, but a deliberate effort to create an escape route from a metal cage. As the light moved further inside the cabin, the most chilling aspect of the scene began to emerge. The car was not empty of life's essentials. It was overflowing with the very items most people would consider indispensable for survival or flight. Sitting inside the mangled frame of the Highlander were Bryce's most vital possessions. His cell phone, the device his mother had used to reach him just 3 hours earlier at 2 in the morning, sat silent on the dash. His laptop, a silver shell containing the digital life of a college sophomore, was tucked away as if it were still waiting for the next semester to begin at Sierra College. To find these items left behind is to look into a mirror of profound disorientation. In our modern world, the phone is our compass, our lifeline, and our identity. By leaving it there, Bryce had effectively severed his connection to the world of the living. He had stepped out of the digital grid at the exact moment he stepped out of the physical wreckage, leaving his trail cold and silent. Just outside the broken rear window, resting on the dusty pavement, was Bryce's duffel bag. It hadn't just fallen there, it appeared to have been placed or dropped with a sense of urgency. The zipper was pulled back, the fabric gaping open. Investigators noted that it looked as though someone had been rummaging through it in the dark, searching for something specific, or perhaps trying to decide what was worth carrying into the wilderness. Inside the bag, or perhaps just beside it, lay his wallet. When the officers opened it, they found everything intact. His driver's license, his credit cards, and the small amount of cash he had left were all there. In a world of cold logic, a person running away takes their money. A person seeking help takes their identification. Bryce had done neither. The investigators continued their inventory. their movements slow and rhythmic as they documented the discarded remnants of a 19-year-old's life. They found small, localized drops of blood on the passenger side headrest and near the back seat, but the volume was minimal. It wasn't the scene of a fatal trauma. It was the scene of a survivor. These red droplets told a story of a young man who had likely been dazed, perhaps nursing a head injury, but who was mobile enough to navigate the jagged edges of a broken window. Yet, as they looked from the blood to the abandoned electronics and the open wallet, the mystery deepened. If he was well enough to break a window and sift through his clothing, he was well enough to understand that he was alone in the dark without a way to call for help. There is a haunting quality to the objects we leave behind. They carry the weight of our intentions and the echoes of our last moments of normalcy. Bryce's white cargo shorts and checkered shirt, the clothes he had been wearing during his long, inexplicable sit in Buttonwillow, were now part of a forensic map. Every item found in or around that Toyota Highlander felt like a breadcrumb that led nowhere. The laptop held no suicide note. The phone held no final, desperate text. Instead, they sat as heavy, silent witnesses to a departure that felt less like an escape and more like a shedding of a former self. He had walked away from the wreckage of his car, and in doing so, he had walked away from the wreckage of his identity, leaving his name and his history in a leather wallet on a dark California road. As the sun finally broke over the horizon at 5:30 that morning, the full scope of the abandonment became clear. The search for Bryce Laspisa was no longer just about a car crash. It was a search for a ghost who had deliberately cast off the anchors of his life. The investigators turned their gaze away from the silver laptop and the leather wallet, looking instead toward the thick, tangled brush that lined the edges of Castaic Lake. Somewhere in that labyrinth of scrub oak and shadowed ravines, a young man was walking into the heat of a new day, carrying nothing but the clothes on his back and the silence of a mind we may never truly understand. The possessions remained, cold and still, while the boy they belonged to vanished into the golden haze of the California morning. The sun had climbed higher now, its heat beginning to bake the golden grass and dry brush surrounding Lake Hughes Road. It had been 9 days since the beige 2003 Toyota Highlander was found resting on its side at the bottom of the ravine, and the initial frantic energy of the search had settled into a heavy, rhythmic determination. The air in Castaic was thick with the scent of dust and sage, a quiet landscape that seemed to hold its breath as the search teams arrived. These were not just human searchers today, they had brought in the specialists. 2 bloodhounds, their long ears sweeping the ground and their deep, soulful eyes focused, were prepared to find a trail that had grown cold in the September heat. The handlers held items of Bryce's clothing, socks and shoes left behind at an apartment, offering the dogs a ghost of a scent to follow into the wilderness. The dogs began at the very spot where the journey had ended in violence. They circled the mangled SUV, sniffing the ground where the rear window had been shattered. You can almost hear the heavy panting of the hounds as they caught the first trace of something familiar. One of the dogs let out a low, steady whine before pulling sharply on its lead. The trail did not lead back toward the road where the police had first gathered. Instead, the scent took them upward, away from the wreckage, and toward a jagged opening in the chain-link fence that lined the perimeter of the recreation area. It was a small, broken gap in the wire, a place where a person in a daze might have slipped through to escape the sight of their own destruction. The handlers followed, their boots crunching on the parched earth as the dogs led them deeper into the shadows of the hills. The path the bloodhounds chose was deliberate. They moved with a strange, haunting certainty through the Golden Hills, tracking the scent across the massive expanse of the Castaic Dam. Imagine the scale of that concrete giant, a gray wall holding back millions of gallons of water, shimmering under the California sun. The wind whips across the top of the dam, carrying the sound of distant traffic and the call of circling birds. The dogs didn't hesitate. They pulled their handlers across the roadway of the dam, their noses never leaving the ground. To the searchers, it felt as though they were following a shadow. Every few hundred yards, the dogs would pause, circling briefly to regain the thread, before pressing on toward the west side of the reservoir. The scent was leading them away from the safety of the main roads and toward the water's edge. As the trail approached the spillway, a sense of dread began to settle over the team. The dogs led them down toward the rugged shoreline where the earth meets the deep, murky blue of the reservoir. The scent grew stronger here, concentrated in the damp soil near the water. The bloodhounds stopped near the edge, their tails falling still as they looked out over the ripples. This was the first of two paths. The suggestion was chilling, that Bryce had walked directly to the shore, perhaps seeking clarity or perhaps something more final. For 4 days, divers would eventually disappear beneath that surface, moving through the cold, dark depths of the lake in search of any sign. They felt through the silt and the submerged brush, but the water kept its secrets. The lake was a mirror reflecting nothing but the empty sky, offering no physical evidence that Bryce had ever entered its embrace. But the mystery did not end at the water's edge. The second bloodhound, working independently, picked up a trail that diverged, leading the searchers away from the reservoir and back toward the industrial pulse of the region. The scent moved south, away from the quiet of the hills and toward the hum of Castaic Road. Here, the natural world begins to fade into the landscape of long-haul truckers and travelers. The dogs tracked the scent all the way to a nearby truck stop, a place where the air smells of diesel fuel and hot asphalt. This was a crossroads, a place of constant movement where people from every corner of the country pause for a moment before disappearing back onto the interstate. The dogs moved through the rows of towering rigs, their noses working frantically against the overwhelming smells of the station, until they reached a point near the edge of the lot. And there, in the middle of the buzzing activity, the trail simply stopped. The sudden end of the scent at the truck stop created a new, agonizing set of questions. When a bloodhound's trail vanishes in a place like that, it often suggests one of two things. Either the individual doubled back, or they stepped into a vehicle. The idea of Bryce, injured and perhaps confused from the crash, wandering into the bright lights of a gas station is haunting. Did he approach a driver? Did he climb into the cab of a truck, seeking a way out of the canyon? Investigators looked for surveillance footage, hoping to see a flash of red hair or a blue and white checkered shirt among the crowd of travelers. But the images were grainy and inconclusive. The truck stop was a vacuum, a place that could have swallowed a young man whole and carried him hundreds of miles away in any direction before the sun had even fully risen over the mountains. So there were two trails leading to two very different fates. One pointed toward the silent, deep waters of the reservoir, a place of stillness and tragedy. The other pointed toward the open road, a path of escape and the unknown. The bloodhounds had done their job, mapping the invisible movements of a boy who had seemingly vanished into thin air. Yet the results only deepened the divide between hope and grief. As the handlers finally led the tired dogs back to the transport vans, the searchers were left standing between the shore and the highway. The wind continued to blow through the dry grass, erasing the physical tracks in the dust, leaving only the memory of a scent that led everywhere and nowhere at once. The trail was cold, and the hills of Castaic remained as silent as they were the morning the car was found. The search for Bryce had entered its 5th day when the stillness of the California canyon was shattered by a new and terrifying development. It was the morning of September 4th, 2013. The sun was already heavy in the sky, baking the parched earth of the Santa Clarita Valley into a dusty gold. A cyclist was making his way along the winding pavement of Lake Hughes Road, just about 3 miles north of where the White Highlander had been discovered. As he pedaled through the dry heat, he spotted a thin, dark plume of smoke rising from the brush. In this part of the state, during the height of a dry summer, smoke is a herald of disaster. Expecting a small brush fire, He called out to the emergency services. But when the firefighters arrived to douse the flames, they found something far more haunting than burning wood. In a shallow patch of charred earth, they discovered the smoldering remains of a human body. Word traveled with the speed of a wildfire. For Michael and Bryce Laspisa, who were already suspended in a state of agonizing limbo, this news was like a physical blow. To have a body found so close to the site of the crash, just a few short miles from where their son had vanished into the night, seemed to point toward a final, devastating conclusion. The canyon, which had felt like a place of secrets, now felt like a tomb. I want you to imagine the sensory overload of that moment. The smell of the smoke hanging in the stagnant air, the sight of the yellow crime scene tape fluttering against the backdrop of the rugged hills, and the oppressive silence that follows a discovery of this magnitude. The authorities immediately cordoned off the area, and for several days, the world waited for the coroner to speak a name. During those 72 hours of waiting, the Laspisa family lived through a unique kind of hell. Every phone call was a potential death sentence. Every knock on the door carried the weight of a definitive end. They were forced to consider the unthinkable. Had Bryce been met with foul play? Had his strange behavior in the days leading up to his disappearance been the precursor to a violent encounter in these lonely hills? The proximity was almost too perfect to be a coincidence. Investigators worked meticulously, sifting through the ash and the bone, searching for dental records or DNA that could provide an answer. The body had been badly burned, making an immediate identification impossible. It was an anonymous tragedy, resting in the center of an ongoing mystery, and for the Laspisas, the wait was a form of torture that surpassed the initial shock of the accident. The local news was saturated with images of the canyon. Reporters stood on the roadside, their voices hushed as they spoke about the missing student and the charred remains. But as the forensic teams worked, the details began to diverge from the profile of the 19-year-old boy everyone was looking for. Eventually, the coroner released a statement that broke the tension for one family while starting a new nightmare for another. The body did not belong to Bryce Laspisa. It was identified as Lamonder Dion Miles, a 35-year-old man from the Florence Firestone neighborhood of South Los Angeles. He had been shot multiple times in the torso before his body was driven to this remote location and set ablaze. It was a brutal, targeted murder, completely unrelated to Bryce's disappearance. 2 men and a woman were later charged with his killing, a crime fueled by a dispute over money. The revelation was a surreal twist in an already bizarre case. It was a cosmic cruelty, a coincidence so sharp it felt intentional. Out of all the vast, empty canyons in Southern California, a second tragedy had been deposited nearly on top of the first. For Michael and Bryce, the news brought a wave of relief so intense it was nearly paralyzing, yet it was a hollow victory. Yes, their son was not the man in the canyon, but that only meant they were back at the beginning. The smoke had cleared, the yellow tape was taken down, and the investigators returned their focus to the reservoir and the scrubland. But the discovery had changed the atmosphere of the search. It reminded everyone that these hills, as beautiful and serene as they appeared at sunset, could swallow a person whole. It reinforced the idea that dangerous things happened in the shadows of the highway. The case of Lamonder Miles was solved, his story given a somber closure, but Bryce remained a ghost. The Laspisas were left to wonder if the coincidence was truly just that, or if the presence of other activity in the canyon meant that Bryce had witnessed something he shouldn't have. Every lead seemed to end in a dead end or a different story entirely. As the sun set on the day of the identification, the canyon returned to its natural state. The crickets began their rhythmic chirping, and the wind sighed through the sagebrush. The search teams went back to the water's edge, back to the trails, and back to the haunting question that had been temporarily eclipsed by the smoke. If Bryce wasn't in the canyon, and he wasn't in the car, where had he gone in those early morning hours? The path ahead was growing darker, and the hope that once burned bright was beginning to flicker like a candle in a deep, cold draft. To understand the disappearance of Bryce Laspisa, we must look beyond the physical map of California and into the architecture of a mind under immense pressure. By late August of 2013, Bryce was 19 years old, standing at the precipice of his sophomore year at Sierra College. To those looking from the outside, he was a typical student, but beneath the surface, a chemical and emotional storm was brewing. Bryce had begun using Vyvanse, a medication typically prescribed for attention deficit disorder, but he was using it recreationally to fuel long, marathon sessions of video gaming. When you pair a powerful stimulant like that with heavy alcohol consumption, sometimes as much as 2 pints of vodka in a single weekend, the biological clock begins to fracture. The mind is forced into a state of artificial wakefulness, a jagged, electric high that eventually gives way to a profound and dangerous exhaustion. It is in this twilight of sleep deprivation that the walls between reality and paranoia begin to thin, turning a familiar drive home into a journey through a distorted landscape. The emotional anchors of his life were also beginning to slip. Just days before he vanished, Bryce sat with his girlfriend, Kim, and told her something chillingly final. He said that she was better off without him. It was a statement that felt less like a breakup and more like a resignation from his own life. Kim was worried. She saw the change in his eyes, the way his logic seemed to spiral in directions she couldn't follow. She even took his car keys at one point, desperate to keep him from driving in a state that felt so precariously unstable. But the keys were eventually returned, and Bryce began a series of actions that looked like a systematic unburdening of his soul. He gave away his most prized possessions, his Xbox, which he loved, and a pair of diamond earrings that had been a gift from his mother. In the language of psychological crisis, these are often red flags, a clearing of the stage, a shedding of the weight of the world before an exit is made. Picture Bryce sitting in his Toyota Highlander, parked in the heavy, shimmering heat of Buttonwillow. For 13 hours, he remained largely stationary. Imagine the silence of that car, the smell of recycled air and old upholstery, the hum of the engine idling or the absolute stillness when it was turned off. He was only a few hours away from home, yet he seemed tethered to that spot by an invisible force. His parents called him repeatedly, and when he answered, he was polite, even calm, but he was not moving. It was an approach-avoidance conflict playing out in slow motion. He wanted to reach the safety of his parents' house in Laguna Niguel, yet something inside him was pushing back, a resistance so strong it kept him paralyzed on the side of the road for an entire day. When the police checked on him, they found a young man who passed their tests, who spoke clearly, yet who was fundamentally elsewhere. There is a haunting possibility that the crash at Castaic Lake was not the beginning of his crisis, but the climax of one that had already taken hold. When the vehicle was finally found on its side at the bottom of a 25-foot embankment, the scene was baffling. The car had been driven with intent, accelerating toward the drop as if the lake at the bottom was a sanctuary. Yet, the car didn't reach the water. It landed in the dirt, the back window kicked out from the inside. Inside the cabin, investigators found only a few drops of blood, not nearly enough to suggest a fatal injury. This brings us to the theory of a traumatic brain injury. If Bryce had survived that impact, dazed and bleeding, a concussion could have stripped away what was left of his orientation. In the cool air of the early morning, a disoriented 19-year-old might have stepped out of that broken window and walked into the shadows, his memory a blank slate, his destination forgotten. Was it a psychotic break fueled by chemicals and a lack of sleep, or was it a desperate attempt to start over? The scent dogs eventually tracked him from the crash site, down toward the water, and then back up to a truck stop on Castaic Road. There, the trail simply ended. It is a point on the map where Bryce Laspisa ceased to be a person and became a mystery. If he walked away, He did so without his wallet, without his phone, and without his laptop. He left behind every tool we use to prove we exist in the modern world. We are left to wonder about those final hours, the pressure of being an only child, the weight of expectations, and the silent, vibrating intensity of a mind that had been awake for far too long. As we move deeper into the night, we hold the image of that empty car and the broken window, a threshold between a life known and a void that has yet to be filled. The scent of diesel and old pavement hangs heavy at the truck stop where the dogs finally lost the trail. For a moment, let us stand there, in the quiet hum of idling engines and the distant rush of the interstate. The physical search for Bryce Laspisa, the frantic combing of the brush around Castaic Lake, eventually gave way to something far more elusive, the search for a face in a crowd. When the trackers stopped, the stories began. These are the fragmented memories, the grainy photos, and the fleeting glimpses of a young man who might have been Bryce, or might have been a ghost of who he used to be. As the years stretched on, the geography of the search expanded from the dusty hills of California to the high mountains of Montana and the misty forests of the Pacific Northwest. Imagine a cool, crisp morning in Missoula, Montana, many years after that strange August night in 2013. The year was 2022. A photo began to circulate on social media, sparking a wildfire of hope that had been dormant for nearly a decade. It showed a young man on a bicycle, his features so strikingly similar to Bryce that even those who knew him best felt a jolt of recognition. He had the same athletic build, the same intense, slightly guarded gaze. Detective Ethan Smith, a man who had looked into countless dead ends, found himself astounded by the resemblance. He tracked the man down, hoping against hope that this was the end of the long mystery. But when he finally stood before him, the illusion shattered. The man was not Bryce. He was simply a twin in spirit, a stranger who happened to carry the same architecture of a face. It was a crushing blow, another fragment that refused to fit the puzzle. Then there are the persistent reports from the north, specifically from the green, rain-washed streets of Eugene, Oregon. It is a place where many young people go to find themselves, or perhaps to lose themselves among the transient and the wandering souls of the West Coast. Sightings here describe a young man with vibrant red hair and piercing blue eyes, often seen at gas stations or sitting quietly in public squares, watching the world move past him. Those who report these encounters speak of a certain distance in the man's eyes, a look of someone who is present in body but drifting in mind. The descriptions match the 19-year-old student who vanished, 5 feet 11 inches tall, about 170 pounds. But in a world where Bryce left behind his wallet and his phone, he left behind the very things we use to prove who we are. Without them, he is just another face in the mist. On his left shoulder, Bryce carries a permanent marker that no amount of time can truly erase. A tattoo of a Taurus bull's head, accompanied by Roman numerals. In many of the reported sightings, witnesses try to catch a glimpse of that shoulder, peering through the thin fabric of a t-shirt or waiting for a movement that might reveal the ink beneath. They look for the blue and white checkered shirt he was last seen wearing, or the white and red Nike shoes that once walked along the edge of a ravine. But time wears down the edges of a description. Clothes are replaced by necessity. Hair grows long, fades in the sun, or is shorn away entirely. The red hair that was once a beacon of identity becomes just another shade in a world of 1,000 colors, making it nearly impossible to distinguish fact from the desperate projections of hope. The question remains, why would someone leave everything behind? In the car, Bryce left his laptop, his phone, and his wallet. To some, this is evidence of a tragedy, a sign that he never intended to walk away from that ravine. But to others, it is the ultimate act of shedding a skin. If one truly wants to disappear, they must leave the digital tether of the modern world. They must become a shadow. Some believe Bryce experienced a profound psychological shift. perhaps a break from reality fueled by days without sleep and the chemicals in his system, and he simply began to walk. They imagine him hitching a ride at that very truck stop where the scent dogs stopped, climbing into the high cab of a long-haul trailer and watching the California hills recede in the rearview mirror, heading toward a life where no one would ever know his name or his history. Each report, from the hills of Tennessee to the quiet suburbs of Los Angeles, adds a layer of static to the case. The human mind is a strange and powerful instrument. It wants to find patterns, and it desperately wants to provide closure where there is none. When a witness sees a young man with red hair, their heart often tells them it is Bryce before their logic can intervene. These sightings are almost always fragmented because they happen in the blink of an eye, at a gas pump under flickering fluorescent lights, through a rain-streaked window, or across a crowded city street. By the time the witness realizes the potential significance of who they saw, the figure has already melted back into the flow of humanity. This is the cruelty of the search. It is a series of echoes, never the voice itself. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children has released age-progressed images, showing what Bryce might look like today, in his late 20s. The boyish roundness of his 19-year-old face has sharpened into the features of a man. His parents, Karen and Mike, still hold a flicker of hope that one of these fragments will one day be whole. They wait for the phone call that isn't a false alarm, for the sighting that doesn't end in a detective's polite and somber apology. For now, the memories remain just that, shards of a life that was interrupted on a dark road near Castaic Lake. We are left with the silence of the woods, the shimmering heat of the highway, and the haunting possibility that he is still out there, just beyond our reach, walking through a dream we cannot share. The sun dips below the rugged peaks of the Sierra Pelona Mountains, casting long, purple shadows across the surface of Castaic Lake. It has been 11 years since the world last heard the voice of Bryce Laspisa. 11 years of seasons changing, of the scrub brush growing thick and then drying to a brittle gold in the relentless California heat. When you stand near Lake Hughes Road today, the air feels heavy with a stillness that is hard to name. The nearby Interstate 5 continues its rhythmic, mechanical pulse, a river of white and red lights flowing toward the horizon, oblivious to the mystery that took root here in the early morning hours of August 30th, 2013. For those who remember, the landscape is more than just earth and water. It is a repository of questions that remain unanswered. The echoes of that summer night still linger in the rustle of the wind and the deep, silent pockets of the canyon. In the quiet of their home, Karen and Mike Laspisa still hold a space for their son. For over a decade, they have lived within the tension of a story that has no final page. Their dedication is visible on the Find Bryce Laspisa Facebook page, a digital vigil where photos of a smiling, red-haired young man are shared alongside messages of hope and remembrance. To lose a child is a tragedy, but to lose one to the unknown is a unique kind of weight, a phenomenon sometimes called ambiguous loss. There is no grave to visit, no final answer to grieve. Instead, there is the persistent, flickering light of a miracle waiting to happen. They reminisce about the special bond they shared, the boy who loved art and had a bright future ahead of him at Sierra College. Every day, they wake up into the same mystery, searching the faces of strangers, hoping that today might be the day the silence finally breaks. Time is a thief, and it has stolen the 19-year-old version of Bryce that the world remembers. To combat the fading of memory, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children released an age-progressed image. It is a haunting piece of forensic art, a bridge between the past and a hypothetical present. In the rendering, Bryce is 29 years old. The boyish softness of his face has been replaced by the structured jawline of a man. His signature red hair is styled differently, and his blue eyes look out from the screen with a maturity he never got to show the world in person. Seeing it is a jarring experience. It makes the passage of 10 years feel tangible. It serves as a reminder that if Bryce is out there, he is no longer the teenager who walked away from an overturned beige 2003 Toyota Highlander. He is a man who has lived a decade of life in the shadows. We return, in our minds, to the ravine off Main Ramp Road. The physical evidence found there was both abundant and hollow. The vehicle had tumbled 15 feet down an embankment, landing on its passenger side. Inside, investigators found Bryce's cell phone, his wallet, and his laptop, the digital anchors of a modern life, all left behind as if they were no longer needed. The rear window had been shattered from the inside, suggesting a deliberate exit after the impact. But from that point, the trail dissolves into the dry earth. There were no signs of a struggle, and despite the use of scent dogs and dive teams in the lake's dark waters, no trace of his physical self was ever recovered. The landscape here is unforgiving, filled with hidden crevices and dense brush that could swallow a secret hole. Even now, locals sometimes glance into the shadows of the canyons, wondering if the earth might one day give up what it took. There have been moments over the years where it seemed the veil might lift. In 2022, a sighting in Missoula, Montana, sent a jolt of electricity through the investigation. A young man on a bicycle bore such a striking resemblance to Bryce that even a seasoned detective was astounded. For a few heart-stopping days, it felt as though the search might be over. But identity checks proved it was merely a double, a cruel trick of chance and genetics. These false leads are the difficult milestones of a long-term missing persons case. They offer a brief, soaring hope followed by a return to reality. Yet each time a new lead emerges, it proves that people are still watching. The world has not forgotten the boy who vanished. His story continues to circulate in podcasts and online forums, a testament to the collective human need to bring a lost soul back into the light. As we pull back from the rugged terrain of Castaic Lake, the details begin to soften. The mystery of Bryce Laspisa remains a part of the California night, woven into the geography of the Santa Clarita Valley. We may never know why he sat by the road for so many hours, or what he was searching for when he turned off his headlights for the last time. But in the quiet moments of the night, we can offer a thought for those who still wait for him. The search continues in the hearts of his family and in the persistent efforts of those who refuse to let his name fade. For now, the wind across the water is the only answer we have. The case rests now. Let the details fade. You are safe. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and have a good night. Sleep well.